Another small task force was started in 1995. It consisted of troopers Jim Bedell and John Schuler from Michigan State Police Post 52 and Detective Sergeant Robin Baker and Detective Brian Campbell from the St. John's Sheriff's Department. They met with Prosecutor Jeff Middleton, and it was decided to outsource the well over 1,000 prints and evidence to Davis Investigations for elimination purposes. Davis was a retired Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant latent print examiner. It was felt that his expertise in print matching might advance the case. The prints that had been collected to date were sent to him, and I don't know how long it took him, but he determined there were no matches to any of them. The 1995 task force also submitted the pink telephone for testing. A Michigan State Police lab report dated November 30th, 1995, determined no additional processing of the phone would be beneficial. They didn't reprocess the phone because they didn't think they'd get anything off it. The case went quiet. In observance of the 10th anniversary of Cathy's murder in 1998, Prosecutor Jeffrey Middleton held a press conference. It was attended by Cathy's family, her father, David, and her mother, Audrey. Middleton said of Cathy, quote, "She was the kind of person you'd never expect to be involved in a homicide. This doesn't happen to people like her. One thing about this terribly heinous crime is that there is someone out there who would do it again, and that's very frightening," end quote. Middleton requested tips, saying he believed someone somewhere knew something. Later, Lieutenant and then retired Chief Ken Baker said, quote, "It's someone who knew her, somebody real close, someone living close by. With the evidence we have, we'll find him," end quote. He was right, but it would take another 2.5 decades. In the 1998 to 1999 time period, retired St. John Sheriff's Department Detective Sergeant Larry Moyer worked on the Cathy Swartz investigation, but, quote, "Results of his investigation are unknown because there are no documents relating to this time period in existence. That was the last time any investigator was assigned to follow up on this incident," end quote. That was written in 2012. However, over the ensuing years, evidentiary items were continually sent to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab by detectives as technology advanced. They tested primarily hairs, bloodstains, and the black underwear. They received confirmation that the DNA on the black underwear was indeed Mike Warner's and Cathy's. In 2001, Prosecutor Jeff Middleton was aware that Michigan State Police lab analyst Glenn Moore had frozen the samples from Cathy's sex assault kit awaiting advancements in technology because the original RLFP testing had not detected sufficient amounts of testable biological material. Now, in 2001, Middleton pushed to have modernized testing conducted. In a letter dated May 11, 2001, to Detective First Lieutenant Thomas Durlam of the Forensic Science Division at the Grand Rapids Lab, Middleton wrote, quote, "I have an important unsolved murder in my jurisdiction that has been vexing us for more than 13 years, end quote. Middleton explained that there was evidence of seminal fluid found in Cathy's vagina. He explained that her autopsy was on a Saturday, and they knew from the investigation she had sexual intercourse with her boyfriend on Wednesday. Quote, "At the time, the state of the RFLP technology dictated that we simply preserve this evidence and wait until technology improved. Glenn Moore assured me several years ago this evidence is frozen and being held at the crime lab in Grand Rapids. I think improvement in technology has arrived, and it's time to try to do more with this exemplar," end quote. It's unclear to me why this wasn't done at the time, but it wasn't. The testing Middleton requested would not be done for 10 more years. By 2002, Detective Earl Stark was chief of police in Three Rivers. He sent in more items for updated testing, hairs found at the scene, and the black underwear and the white underwear. No advancements were made. By 2008, Jeff Middleton had become a county judge, and new St. Joseph County Prosecutor Douglas Fisher issued a press release on the 20th anniversary of Cathy's murder. It requested the public's assistance in identifying the person who left a bloody footprint found in the apartment. He revealed by this time investigators had compared the foot impressions of more than 5,000 people. No one had proved to be a match. Quote, "If the person leaving that footprint is alive and criminally active, he or she will be located and called upon to explain how that footprint came to be made in Cathy's apartment," Fisher said. In 2011, yet another task force was convened now that DNA testing and forensic analysis had improved to the point that the tests were much more discerning using smaller amounts of evidence. The task force determined there were several items of evidence that were completely missing. These were the markers found in the living room in Cathy's house, the candy cane found outside the back door, the camera gathered from Cathy's bedroom, the shower curtains, and the clump of hair that didn't seem to be Cathy's that had been found in the bathroom near the bathtub. However, some items did remain in evidence, and it was determined they were appropriate for further testing. These were the human blood samples from Troy Schulte's truck, once again the black underwear, Q-tips from the bathroom sink that tested positive for human blood, Cathy's vaginal swabs and vaginal smears, which had been frozen back in the 1980s, Cathy's nightshirt, nail scrapings collected from Troy Schulte's, and the white underwear containing seminal fluid and sperm cells. While the testing was being conducted, the 2011 investigators reviewed the footwear and foot impressions on the tile removed from the bathroom floor and compared them to transparencies of Cathy's foot. They concluded that the bloody footprints definitely did not belong to Cathy. They also confirmed that the shoe print was indeed nearly identical to the sole pattern of the McGregor shoes that had been traced back to Kmart. The task force also reviewed the case file and the list of potential persons of interest in the case and made a lengthy and detailed to-do list of people to follow up on. They noted that even people who had been eliminated by prints might need to be reconsidered, because the print examiners back in the day may just have been eyeballing the prints rather than looking at them in a more scientific manner. They also noted many holes in the investigation. Their task was made all the more difficult because they quickly recognized that the original detectives on the case had not written down much of what they'd done or their conclusions. Trying to figure out what was needed to be followed up on was very complicated. One priority follow-up item was initial suspect Troy Schulte's. Notes from the 2011 task force labeled Troy as a continued person of interest. They say, quote, Troy Schulte's has no verifiable alibi from 10 a.m. until 2:40 p.m., There are discrepancies in his statement as compared to his then-girlfriend and mother's statements. Task force officers received information about a rumor that Troy's father may have helped him clean up after the incident. Troy Schulte's has been eliminated by prints, end quote. The blood in the truck tested as inconsistent with Cathy's. However, it was noted that Troy's father's prints were never acquired, and he had died and was cremated. Prior to cremation, the funeral home had refused to allow collection of a DNA sample without a warrant. They weren't going to be able to rule out Mr. Schulte's. They had to move on. Here's just some examples of some of the actions the 2011 task force took. They tracked down a lot of men whose prints had been deemed of poor quality, or who had only given either fingerprints or footprints but not both, and tried to collect better quality prints. They tried to figure out the name of a man Cathy had dated while they both worked at Burger King. His name was not in the original file. It was possible the original investigators hadn't been able to find him. They also noted that another Burger King employee who worked there when Cathy worked there had become heavily involved in drugs and alcohol and died of an overdose in 2009. Another employee was described as having an explosive temper and was very jealous. And yet another employee had multiple arrests for domestic violence since Cathy's death. None of these had finger and footprints eliminated according to modern standards. These men's names were put on the list for follow-up. They also followed up on an anonymous tip that a certain man had shown up for work at the Burger King on Saturday, December 3rd, 1988, the day after the murder, with cuts and bruises all over his hands. He had never been interviewed or fingerprinted. They considered reports in the file that a woman who had lived in Cathy's apartment prior to Cathy had a violent boyfriend who might have returned. They noted that the guy Randy F., who had been in school with Cathy and talked about her murder to strangers, needed to submit elimination prints. They decided to try to track down prints of a guy who'd been arrested in Louisiana in 1969 for disorderly conduct and lived in Three Rivers when Cathy was killed. He was suspicious because on March 20th, 1989, he took a buyout from his employer, Hydromatic, and moved to Alabama and then South Carolina. His fingerprints on file from his arrest had been eyeballed by Detective Sergeant Stark, and he was eliminated that way. The task force decided they needed to follow up on this guy. They looked into a report about a guy who was in the Cass County Jail in 1989 and snitched that another inmate stated that someone he knew had used a broken bottle to kill Cathy. They followed up on an old tip stating that a pair of Bad News brothers had been to a party in a nearby apartment the night before Cathy's murder, and they'd both later been incarcerated in Indiana prisons for a forced rape using a knife. They followed up on a tip from the St. Joseph's County Sheriff's Department about an inmate at the Cincinnati, Ohio VA's hospital who said he had information on Cathy's murder. This was that his daughter had been in a domestic assault situation with her boyfriend, and the boyfriend had choked her and said he murdered Cathy Swartz, and the same thing was going to happen to her. They actually managed to get this guy's prints, and they didn't match the suspect print in APHIS. Test results on all the items the investigators had submitted in 2011 really failed to advance the case. The blood in Troy's truck was not Cathy's. Both the black underwear and the white underwear containing seminal fluid and sperm cells came back to Mike Warner. The Q-tips from the bathroom sink with blood on them proved to be Cathy's blood. There was no seminal fluid or sperm found on Cathy's nightshirt. But then, the money ball. This dated January 2012. Quote, responding detective, this is Mike Mooney, spoke with David Hayhurst from the Grand Rapids Crime Lab. He is processing the DNA. During our conversation, he inquired about some blood samples taken from the telephone where the unknown print was taken. Apparently, lab analyst Glenn Moore had taken some blood samples from this phone that had never been entered into CODIS. The profile is that of a male subject not matching Troy or either of the Mikes, end quote. Hold up. There was a male DNA profile from blood on the pink phone that was found on Cathy's bed with an unidentified foreign fingerprint on it. 2012, 24 years after Cathy's murder, was the first Three Rivers police were hearing about this. This blood sample, smeared on a slide, had been frozen at the lab all these years, and in 2012, when the lab guy David Hayhurst decided to review all the evidence, he found it. And what was even more exciting was that the sample was suitable for entry into CODIS. This was done in March of 2012. This was a big step in the investigation, and I think it's safe to say most of the investigators were certain they would finally be able to solve this case. But it wasn't to be. There were no hits to the profile entered in the database. So now police had the suspect's fingerprint in APHIS and his DNA in CODIS. They had his footprint. They had the profile. They believed he was white, wore McGregor sneakers, and had a red jacket with a black and white silhouette on the back. And he knew Cathy. Who the hell was he?
It was late, past midnight, when they broke into the farmhouse.
Never in a million years would you think that you'd see your parents' house taped off by that yellow tape. Oh. And they said your mom died of being killed.
They left behind a wall of blood and the key to a secret.
It was a very brutal crime scene, one of the worst I've ever seen.
Murder in the Moonlight, a new podcast from Dateline. Listen now.
By 2014, Mike Mooney, one of the first responding officers on the day of Cathy's murder, was a detective sergeant in the Three Rivers Police Department, and he was in charge of Cathy's case. Having been inside the crime scene himself, he remembered exactly how brutal the slaying had been. And he was just as frustrated as all the previous investigators, men like Earl Stark and Ken Baker, who had each gone on to be police chief and then retired without answers. By this point in 2014, police had footprinted 5,000 people. They had also tested the DNA from the crime scene against Cathy's family, Mike Warner, Troy, Mike H., all their families, everyone else without finding a match. WSBT.com did a cold case profile, and Cathy's father, David Swartz, cited his frustration. Quote, especially with all the evidence they've got. They can tell you the kind of shoe the person wore, the footprints, the fingerprints, DNA. They have everything, but yet they haven't got anyone, end quote. David had been profiled in 2013, the quarter-century anniversary of Cathy's murder. He told the Sturgis Journal then, quote, for 25 years, someone out there knows something that is yet to be provided to the proper authorities. I had hoped Cathy's mom would be alive long enough to see the case solved, but Audrey died last year. At least she's finally together with Cathy again. I go to the grave every year on December 2nd, but I go a lot of other times too. Her mother is buried right there with her, so it's a place I go to feel connected with them again. End quote. Judge Middleton spoke to the Journal as well. He said, quote, a lot of police resources went into the Cathy Swartz case, so much so that it seems the Three Rivers Police Department suspended all operations in the aftermath and devoted everything it had to the case. Earl Stark and Kenny Baker were the lead detectives on the case, and they had blood samples, they had footprints and fingerprints. So there was a great deal of confidence that this would eventually be solved. End quote. But it wasn't. Middleton said he felt sure that if he kept going over the case file, he would see the answer, but he didn't. And spoiler alert, it was there. In 2022, the Three Rivers Police Department had a new chief of police, Scott Bowling, and he learned that the Cathy Swartz case remained the only unsolved murder in the small city of Three Rivers. In May of that year, Sam Smolcombe, the only detective sergeant on the Three Rivers police force at that time, was contacted by Joel Schultze, the Michigan State Police Grand Rapids DNA lab director. Schultze told him that there was still physical evidence in the Swartz case. A slide sample of the suspect's blood from the phone that had yielded an STR profile in 2012 was still sitting in a freezer and remained testable. Schultze also told Detective Sergeant Smolcombe that the Michigan State Police had received some grant funds for DNA testing in cold cases. Schultze wanted to know whether the Three Rivers Police would consider submitting the Cathy Swartz homicide for forensic genealogy testing. So on May 19th, Chief Scott Bowling, Prosecutor Dave Marvin, and Detective Sergeant Smolcombe met with Schultze and agreed to submit DNA from Cathy's case to Othram Labs. The Michigan State Police cold case grant funds would pay for the analysis. The phone blood sample on the slide was rehydrated by the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, and swabs of that liquid sample were submitted to Othram. Othram was able to develop a SNP profile using its forensic-grade genome sequencing, as it calls its proprietary methodology. The SNP profile was uploaded to the open-source databases, and the closest relative they found shared 228 centimorgans with the suspect. This was a level of shared DNA consistent with a third or fourth cousin. To identify him, they built trees out to the great-great-grandparent level to find the most recent common ancestor. This took quite a bit of time, months, and finally on January 16, 2023, Detective Sergeant Smolcombe was notified by Joel Schultze that Othram had results to report. On the 17th, Smolcombe and the chief had a meeting with Othram, Prosecutor Dave Marvin, and Joel Schultze. The investigative lead that Othram had generated was that the suspect was likely one of the 5 sons of Judith and John Waters. 5 sons, that was a lot of follow-up. But wait, Othram was able to narrow down the priority leads to 3 of the brothers. One of the 5 siblings, Charles S., was only a half-sibling of the others, and was most likely not the contributor of the suspect DNA and evidence because he had a different parent and because he did not live in Three Rivers at the time of the murder. Furthermore, the youngest son, Barry, was excluded because his DNA was in CODIS and would have hit to the suspect STR DNA sample in the database since 2012. That left Jim, Sammy, and Robert. Some of these are pseudonyms, but I won't tell you which ones yet. At this point in the investigation, as listeners know, is often the time when investigators decide to obtain surreptitious DNA samples. After all, they didn't know which brother was their suspect. A surreptitious DNA grab would allow them to test the DNA without alerting the brothers that they were indeed suspects. But that's not the route they decided to go. The Three Rivers Police and the Michigan State Police conducted intelligence workups of the Waters brothers. Barry turned out to be in multiple state DNA databases because he'd committed offenses in multiple jurisdictions, mandating DNA submission. Jim was living elsewhere in Michigan. Robert was living in South Carolina and was a plumber. Sammy was living in Three Rivers and was older than the other 3. He was married with children when Cathy was killed. Detective Sergeant Smolcombe called up Sammy and asked him to come down to the police station. He came in for an interview on February 1st, 2023, no doubt wondering what this was all about. Smolcombe did a great job at building rapport with Sammy. Once he found out where Sammy worked, he said, "Oh, my cousin retired from there," and asked him if he knew him, and of course, being a small town, Sammy did indeed know the cousin. They laughed over it a little bit. Smolcombe told Sammy that they were investigating the Cathy Swartz murder from 1988, and his name came up on a list. Sammy didn't remember it, and when asked, he said he didn't know Cathy or Mike Warner. Smolcombe said, "You don't really fit our suspect profile because you were about 10 years older than Cathy. You probably weren't running with the same crowd." He told Sammy they were looking for someone Cathy knew, so they assumed he was about her age and was from the Three Rivers and Mendon areas. Sammy seemed genuinely puzzled. Smolcombe asked about Sammy's brothers. Sammy confirmed that Charles was a half-sibling, and he was in the Marine Corps in 1988 and not around. Asked about his 3 other brothers, he said they had lived in the Three Rivers area in 1988. Now, Jim lived in a different town, and they spoke a couple of times a year. The other 2 he'd kind of lost touch with. Barry, he said, had gotten into a lot of trouble, and they didn't speak. Robert, whom he called Robbie, had gotten into a little trouble, and they put him in a juvenile home for a while. Robert sounded interesting. Sammy said that after juvie, Robert met his wife who got him to move away for a fresh start. He now lived in South Carolina. Wrapping up, Smolcombe casually asked Sammy to give a DNA sample. Sammy agreed, saying he would love to help in any way he could. A buccal swab was collected then and there. Meanwhile, Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Todd Peterson interviewed Jim Waters. Jim, it turned out, was in the case file. He told Peterson that he used to work with Troy at the grocery store, D&W Foods, when Troy was dating Cathy. They were all friends. He bought them beer sometimes, and Cathy and Troy came over to hang out at his apartment. Jim had no idea who killed Cathy, but he was very willing to give a DNA sample, which Detective Sergeant Peterson happily collected. The brothers' DNA samples were sent to the Michigan State Police lab, which determined that neither sample matched the suspect's sample. Then Jim's sample was sent to Othram, which performed kinship testing. They selected just one brother to kinship test because they didn't need to waste money testing both, since both men were in the same position on the family tree. Othram's kinship analysis showed that Jim Waters shared DNA with the suspect consistent with a full sibling. The Michigan State Police lab also tested the fingerprints of both Jim and Barry Waters. Neither of them was a match to the bloody fingerprint on the phone. Who was left? Robert. Investigation into Robert revealed that he was born Robert Odell Waters on June 23, 1969. He grew up in Michigan, but had moved to Beaufort, South Carolina in 1989. He and his wife, whom I'm calling Jenny, ran a plumbing business called Waters Plumbing of the Low Country, and they shared some children. On April 4th, Detective Sergeant Smallcomb and Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Paul Gagnon drafted search warrants for the cell phones of Robert and Jenny Waters. Quote, "This was to establish a pattern of life for Robert and Jenny and to assist us in making contact with Robert," end quote. The search warrants were signed by Judge Patterson and turned over for service to the phone company, and the police started monitoring the couple's calls while they drafted search warrants for biological samples from Robert Waters. Detective Sergeant Smallcomb got in touch with investigator Nicole Anderson of the Beaufort Police Department and brought her up to speed on the case. He provided her with the search warrant for Robert Waters' DNA, fingerprints, and footprints. She began work on getting those into a format accepted by the local courts, who would be issuing the search warrants in South Carolina, and finally got them signed by Judge Bonds on April 28th. Again, the Michigan investigators decided on a direct approach. They were going to contact Robert Waters and ask him some questions before executing the search warrant. He was unlikely to flee, they felt. They knew that Waters was firmly established in his community and had lived there with his family for decades. He relied on his business for his livelihood. Robert was a plumber, so they decided not to contact him during business hours during the week. They settled on a weekend. Once the search warrants for DNA, fingerprints, and footprints were ready and everything was in place, on April 30th, 2023 at 7 a.m., the investigators gathered in the training room at the Beaufort Police Department. Participating in the takedown of Waters were Detective Sergeant Scott Peterson and Detective Sergeant Paul Gagnon of the Michigan State Police, Detective Sergeant Sam Smallcomb of the Three Rivers Police Department, Three Rivers Chief Scott Bowling, and several personnel from the Beaufort Police Department Investigations Division, Lieutenant Anthony Reed, Sergeant Joshua Dowling, Sergeant Skylar Waddell, Investigator Nicole Anderson, Patrol Officer Sterling Weirin, and Patrol Officer Hisham Anis. The plan was to go to Robert Waters' home early that morning and attempt to get him outside the house, if possible. As we've reviewed in other cases, approaching the suspect outdoors is designed to ensure that the suspect can't access any guns he may have in his home, and no one else who may be in the home can assist him or be placed into a hostage situation. They saw from Waters' cell phone location services that his phone was turned on and he was at home just before 8 a.m. The patrol officers started surveillance on the house and notified the investigators at 8:40 a.m. that Waters had walked out of his house and gone into the detached garage workshop. Perfect. Here are my notes from watching the body cam video. Smallcomb and Peterson approach Waters at a small home closely packed in with neighbors' houses. These guys aren't being subtle. They're wearing bulletproof vests emblazoned with their agency names. They knock on the garage door and Waters comes out holding a container of something he's using in the garage. He's wearing a red t-shirt and shorts. He's just as jovial as can be. "Good morning, how you doing? How can we help ya?" Then they introduce themselves, and you can barely tell that he realizes he's screwed when he hears they're from Michigan police agencies. "Oh, sure, hi, nice to meet you." He invites them into the garage. Once inside, he stands with his arms crossed, and they say, "We aren't here out of the blue. We've talked to your brothers back in February. after we reopened a case from Three Rivers PD back in the day. They did not mention Cathy Swartz. They explained, we're trying to clear all the people who aren't in Michigan. Waters does not seem perturbed at all. Michigan State Police Detective Sergeant Peterson's notes say, quote, "It should be noted that Robert did not ask us what we were investigating or why we wanted to speak with him," end quote. I imagined that one of his brothers back in Michigan had told him that the police had come calling, asking about a cold case. Waters' phone records showed a recent incoming call from his brother Sammy, even though Sammy had reported the two didn't talk much. Anyway, Waters says, "Sure, I'll come down to the station for a chat." They say, "Sorry for stopping by unannounced, but we got to get everything done on these trips. It gets kind of expensive. I think we'll get you in and out of there pretty quick." Waters gets directions to the station. They say, "We'll meet you down there," and they leave. So I know you're wondering whether Waters showed up at the police station as agreed. At 10:08 a.m., when Waters was a no-show, Detective Sergeant Peterson put a call into Waters, which went right to voicemail. He waited about a half hour and called again. This time, Waters answered. Peterson said, "Hey, we're still here, just wondering if you're coming down, what's going on?" Waters asked, "You want to talk to me about what again?" Peterson explained, "We just want to talk to you about a cold case we reopened from Three Rivers, the murder of a girl there." Waters asked, "When was that?" 1988. "When in 88? Because we were in Arizona because my daughter was born in Phoenix." A quote from Peterson. He stated he didn't feel it would be appropriate for him to come down and talk to us without his attorney. "Then I kind of felt like the game was up. He knew why we were here," end quote. Waters said he'd spoken with his attorney, but the investigators noted neither his cell nor his wife's was used to make this call. They must have used the landline phone in the house, suspecting that their phones were tapped. So Peterson had to figure out how to get Waters to agree to leave the house peacefully and come down to the station so they could serve the search warrant on him. He talked to Waters for a little bit, and Waters said he would come in the following week with his attorney. Well, they didn't want to wait a week. Peterson asked Waters to have his attorney call his cell. The attorney, Scott Lee, did call at 10:46 a.m. This is a quote from Peterson. "So we explained to the attorney that we did, in fact, have search warrants for his DNA, fingerprints, and footprints, and we'd rather he consensually come in and submit to that versus us executing the warrant and kicking his door in and possibly somebody gets hurt," end quote. In the end, they agreed that Waters would come in and submit to the requirements of the search warrant, but the police were not allowed to ask him any questions. At 11:25 a.m., patrol officers went to his home and picked him up. His wife, Jenny, walked him outside, and they told her husband would call her when he was ready for pickup. The officers put him in the back of the patrol car and brought him back to the station to submit fingerprints. They decided to start with the fingerprints because they could relatively quickly compare them to those in evidence and decide whether there was probable cause to proceed with executing the rest of the search warrant. Detective Sergeant Peterson explained later that this whole thing was excruciating because the Beaufort Police Department did not have a live scan digitized fingerprinting system, so they had to obtain ink and paper prints from Waters. It took them numerous tries to obtain prints of the different parts of his fingers to get the portion of the fingerprints they needed to compare to the one in evidence. Finally, once the prints were obtained and dried, they had to scan them using a high-resolution scanner and email them back to Michigan for 2 fingerprint examiners from the Michigan State Police waiting on standby to analyze and compare to the print in evidence. The scans were transmitted, and they waited. As they waited, Waters was again advised that he was not under arrest, and they chatted, Peterson and the suspect and some of the Beaufort cops. Waters seemed completely unfazed in his shorts and flip-flops, talking about his business, breaking his back in 2018, the weather, remodeling homes, their kids, movies. They were standing for a large part of the time, but then transitioned to sitting because it was taking so long. After about an hour, the investigators were contacted by Detective Sergeant Flowers with the Michigan State Police lab. He requested a second set of Waters' fingerprints that included the first knuckle. Those were taken and submitted. Approximately a half hour later, Detective Sergeant Flowers called again and requested the tip of Waters' fingers on his right hand. This all took time, 5 hours to be exact. Waters drank a bottle of his namesake, and they made chit-chat while they waited. Once he finished his water and threw it in the trash can, they surreptitiously grabbed the water bottle and packaged it to preserve it for DNA. They also took Waters' footprints using paper and rolling his feet. It was later determined those prints weren't of sufficient quality for comparison. Detective Sergeant Todd Peterson said later in a TV interview that he worked to keep Waters engaged in small talk for all those hours, and he noted that Waters seemed to have no concerns about how long the whole thing was taking. He was very pleasant, patient, and calm. Here is a quote from Detective Sergeant Peterson's report. At approximately 4:31, we received word from Detective Sergeant Flowers that Waters' fingerprint was a match to the suspect fingerprint found at the scene, end quote. It was him. Peterson notified Detective Sergeant Smallcombe, who then used the confirmation that the prints matched as probable cause to request that charges of open murder be authorized. He submitted an affidavit of probable cause to Prosecutor Dave Marvin, requesting charges of open murder on Robert Waters. Marvin wrote up a complaint and authorized it, and it was submitted to the magistrate Tabitha Wedge. The magistrate reviewed it and issued a warrant for the arrest of Robert Waters for the murder of Cathy Swartz. Meanwhile, Detective Sergeant Peterson informed Waters that the print matched and they would now be collecting a DNA sample. Waters allowed them to do so. Then Sam Smallcombe came in and said, "We did submit the print. It did match the one at the crime scene. The prosecutor did authorize a warrant. So at this time, you are under arrest for the murder of Cathy Swartz." Waters literally just nodded as if they were telling him it was sunny outside. "Okay," he shrugged. They gave him their business cards and said they would be in the area for one more day, and if he and his attorney decided they would like to speak to them, they would be happy to do so. Waters got up, was handcuffed by Officer Weirin of the Beaufort Police Department, and was transferred to the Beaufort County Jail. Everyone agreed that his lack of emotion about the whole thing was remarkable and suspicious. If he were innocent, he would have protested or questioned the police. There was none of that. He knew it was coming and that fighting it was futile. After Waters was taken away, Peterson called Waters' wife, Jenny. She had called the station very worried about what was going on with her husband and what was taking so long. Peterson told her that her husband had been arrested for a murder in Michigan in 1988. She had a lot of questions, and the detective sergeant told her her husband was going to have to be the one to answer them. An extradition hearing was held for Waters on May 1st, 2023. Waters waived extradition and agreed to be transported back to Michigan to face murder charges. On May 2nd, Detective Sergeant Smallcombe traveled back to Michigan, bringing with him Waters' water bottle, DNA swabs, and print cards. Once he arrived, he submitted everything to the Michigan State Police lab. On May 6th, a Saturday, at 6:45 a.m., Detective Sergeant Smallcombe received a phone call from Beaufort City Police Department investigator Nicole Anderson that he didn't want to get. He was notified that Waters was found dead in his Beaufort County Detention Center cell at 12:16 a.m. He called Waters' wife Jenny and notified her over the phone of her husband's death. They also made contact with David Swartz and Courtney Swartz and notified them of the situation. Smallcombe later said that Cathy's brother David and the Three Rivers community as a whole was relieved. Almost immediately after Waters' suicide, the DNA results came in from the Michigan State Police lab. The Cathy Swartz crime scene DNA was a match to Robert Waters. His blood on the pink phone proved he was at the scene at the time of Cathy's death. On August 24, 2023, Detective Sergeant Smallcombe received the autopsy report from the Beaufort County coroner and the investigative report from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, regarding the death of Robert Waters. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as asphyxia due to hanging. The manner of death was suicide. Waters had been found dead in his cell hanging from a sheet noose shortly after midnight on the 6th. He was the only inmate in his cell, and common area cameras showed no one going into or out of his cell after lights out, so there was no question that his death was self-inflicted. The jail was operated by a private organization, not the sheriff's office. Waters had waited until after a shift change and cell check to take action. He left no note. Guards found religious pamphlets on a table in his cell with sections ripped out discussing creationism and God. Further, the delay in extradition was due to staffing issues at the Beaufort County Sheriff's Department. Nothing nefarious was to blame. At Waters' autopsy, foot impressions were collected for comparison to the bloody ones found in Cathy's bathroom. The Michigan State Police Crime Lab confirmed his footprints matched those at the scene. Of Waters' suicide, St. Joseph County Prosecuting Attorney Dave Marvin told CBS 3, quote, "I believe this says he was guilty. He not only is guilty, but he was a coward because he had the ability to explain to people what he owed people an explanation for, and he decided to take another exit," end quote. As Sam Smallcombe said to me, "Now we will never know why." The Three Rivers Police Department held a press conference on May 11, 2023, announcing the closure of the Cathy Swartz investigation and the identification via DNA and prints of Robert Waters as the lone suspect. Chief Bowling said, "While nothing can replace the loss of Cathy Swartz and the impact this senseless tragedy has had, we hope the identification and arrest of a suspect will bring some long-awaited closure to her family and friends." He noted that Waters' suicide was disappointing because the investigators were hoping to get some answers and pass those along to Cathy's family. Sam Smolcom, who is now deputy chief, noted that both of Cathy's parents had passed away and weren't around to see the resolution of their daughter's case. Earl Stark and Ken Baker, the original investigators, had both also passed away. Chief Brinkman, who had been one of the first responding officers, had retired without seeing the case solved. It stuck in his craw, Smolcom said. In the end, they used forensic genealogy because they had exhausted every other lead. As he put it, Waters kept out of trouble for 35 years. We would not have solved it without genealogy. Smolcom emphasized what a relief it was to the community that the case was solved. The Swartzes were unsettled that the killer could be walking by them in the grocery store, and the Three Rivers residents were uneasy for decades at the thought that a murderer lived among them. Okay, so how did Robert Waters come across Cathy Swartz? What do we know? The Waters brothers grew up in Flowerfield, outside Three Rivers. According to Deputy Chief Smolcom, Waters never got more than a traffic ticket. He was not on police radar back in 1988. Should he have been? Well, as we know from his brother Sammy's interview, Waters had gotten, air quote, in trouble and sent to juvie. But Sammy was a lot older than Robert and didn't know what his brother had done to get sent away. When Deputy Chief Smolcom tried to find out, he learned that all the records from juvenile had long ago been purged. So to this day, we don't know why Robert Waters was sent to the juvenile system. It's unclear whether 1988 detectives would have been able to learn about his juvenile record or whether they were able to gather info on all juveniles in the system. Anyway, Waters apparently met his wife around this time. In 1988, the Waters family home burned down, and Waters, his parents, his girlfriend Jenny, and possibly his 3 sisters moved to Arizona at that time, estimated to be in September of 1988. Cathy was killed in December. So Waters didn't live in the state when Cathy was killed. But he did appear in the case file. Criminal justice students from Western Michigan University digitized the entire Cathy Swartz case file and facilitated searchability. This from Western Michigan University's blog, quote, "There were over 10,000 documents that students then scanned into one large document so detectives knew what information they had in the file and could access it quickly," end quote. Searches for the name Waters brought up 3 of them. Remember when I said the police obtained fingerprints from male co-workers of Troy's at the D&W Foods where he worked in 1987 when he was dating Cathy? One of these was Jim Waters, a pseudonym, who was friendly with Cathy and Troy and bought them beer. He gave elimination prints way back in 1988 or 1989. Jim was a brother of Robert Waters. Police had also looked at Barry Waters, another brother. Barry was known to police around the time of the murder as a local criminal, and when he was arrested, his fingerprints were compared to the suspect print and evidence. Barry ended up being required to put his DNA in CODIS, too, so he was formally eliminated. I wasn't able to find out what he was put in the system for, but public arrest records show convictions in Tennessee and Wisconsin for assault, resisting and obstructing police, carry a concealed knife, and domestic assault. So police looked at Barry and Jim. It turned out the investigators back in 1988 had considered Robert Waters, too. The original detectives had gotten the name of Robbie Waters from Mike Warner during one of his initial interviews. He had been asked for the names of anybody he thought Cathy knew or anybody who had been to the apartment. Robbie Waters was on that list. Mike and Robert Waters were classmates and friends at Park Elementary, and Mike recalled that Robert had even slept over a few times. They had built forts and done other boy stuff together. They grew apart in middle and high school. But at Three Rivers High School, Robert Waters and Mike Warner appeared just one person away from each other in the senior yearbook. And then Robert and his family moved away. But back in December 1988, Mike had reported that he ran into Robert Waters and his girlfriend at a grocery store in town in late 1988. The two were visiting their home state from their new home in Phoenix. Mike and Robert caught up a little bit, and Mike invited them over to the apartment to hang with him and Cathy. So Robert and his girlfriend came over one night and spent some time with Cathy and Mike at Cathy's place about a month before the murder. No one knew that Robert Waters had returned to Michigan in early December, which is when he killed Cathy. 1988 investigators, gathering their massive list of names to look at, took down Robert Waters' name from Mike. But when they went to follow up, they learned he lived in Arizona and had moved there 3 months before Cathy was killed. Arizona is not right next door to Michigan. Investigators had thousands of men who were local to investigate. Waters was disregarded. When he learned that his elementary school fort-building buddy had returned and killed Cathy, Mike Warner was shocked. He said he never would have suspected his friend. As I've hinted throughout this episode, mistakes were made in this case. Evidence, such as the shower curtains, which were almost certainly smeared with Robert Waters' blood, were lost. The bloody shower taps were not collected. Detectives did not keep notes, much less make official reports. On one of the crime scene videos, a Michigan State Police crime scene technician can be seen touching items with no gloves on. Detective Stark used the kitchen phone to call 911, and so on. But this case also received an incredible amount of attention and dedication from the investigators. I would say it was one of the hardest worked cases I've covered. And it's unfortunate, but also understandable, that Robert Waters' name was missed. After all, he lived in Arizona and had no connection to Cathy. There were hundreds of people right there in Three Rivers and Mendon whom police had to consider. The random name mentioned one time as having been to the apartment a month before the murder simply didn't seem like a priority. And despite the problems with the evidence in this case, the fact is that Robert Waters' blood and fingerprint was on the phone with a cut cord, and his footprint in Cathy's blood was in the bathroom. There was no good reason for him to be in that house. So what was 19-year-old Robert Waters doing there? Remember the witness Geraldine, who saw the bushy-haired person entering Cathy's apartment around 10:45 a.m. on the day of the murder. She described the person as having sandy, bushy hair and being 5'4". Waters did have sandy, bushy hair and was 5'8", on the shorter side for a man. The sketch of the air-quote woman seen by Geraldine looks quite a bit like Waters. Investigators believe he might have stopped by Cathy's on a ruse, asking to use the phone. You can hear how it might have gone down. "Hey, Cathy, remember me? I'm Mike's friend from elementary school." Or, "I'm John's brother from the grocery store. I was here with my girlfriend about a month ago." Yeah, nice to see you too. "Hey, my car broke down. I'm wondering if I could use your phone to call for help." Or he could simply have pretended that he was stopping by to see Mike, knowing very well that Mike was at work. Police think Cathy was in the kitchen cooking when Waters stopped by. The stove vent fan was on, and a pan of something that looks like possibly a biscuit or grilled cheese was on the stove. The blood drops and bloody bare footprints showed that Cathy was bleeding in the kitchen, and the investigators surmised that she was hit in the face hard, probably provoking a nosebleed. Nothing in the kitchen showed a fierce struggle. The very cluttered countertops remained so, with nothing knocked over or spilled. Still, we don't know whether Cathy was hit, or perhaps Waters came at her with a sharp blade. There are a lot of not small blood droplets on the kitchen floor. Police think he punched her, but he could have tried to stab her, and she threw her hands up and he slashed her hands. Remember, they were found with defensive cuts. Either way, they both left footprints in blood on the kitchen floor. Hers were bare, and his were in the McGregor sneakers. Cathy turned and ran into the foyer and up the stairs, no doubt thinking of baby Courtney up there, and for that reason, not running out of the house. On her frantic dash up the stairs, she left blood smeared on the stairway walls and railing. She was being stabbed in the back as she ran, and this might be when her killer cut himself. Cathy then ran down the very short hallway to her bedroom. She desperately tried to slam the door on her attacker, remember the bloody handprints on the door and door handle, and get to the phone. She did grab the phone, but her assailant had caught up to her by now, and grabbed the phone receiver from her, leaving his bloody print on it, and severed the phone cord with his weapon. Cathy cowered on the floor between the bed and the far wall. Blood spatter there showed she was hit with blows from both the left and right side of her head. Remember that the evidence on Cathy's body pointed to her being alive after being injured for about 15 minutes. The first blitz until her death was a quarter of an hour, during which she was trying desperately to save herself. But she could not. Investigators believe her throat was cut there down on the side of the bed, where the blood spray, broken bottles, and bloody pillow were found. But then her body was moved. What was extremely odd and unsettling was Waters moved her dead body, pulling her out of that narrow space, turning her 180 degrees, and laying her down on the floor with her head and shoulders near the door, for unknown reasons. This is a quote from an investigative report. "When the body was found in the bedroom, the curtains in the room were closed. However, there was blood on the curtain and pull cord in the bedroom. Because of the blood location in the curtains, it is believed the curtains were open prior to the injuries being inflicted on the victim." So the killer closed the curtains, and this was perhaps when he touched her, smearing blood on her breasts, stomach, and legs, and doing who knows what else. Not one sperm cell from Waters was found anywhere in the apartment. Of course, this could be as simple as police couldn't test everything. The room was a mess of clothing. Most of it wasn't collected. Or perhaps he just masturbated and made a mess of his own clothing. Perhaps he moved her into the doorway so he could see her from the bathroom as he masturbated there. Either way, looking at the crime scene photos, with Cathy's raised nightshirt, lack of underwear, and blood smeared all down her chest, torso, and legs, tells me he was doing something to her. When he was done, the investigators believe Waters went into the bathroom and took a shower, smearing blood on the curtains and leaving the watery, bloody, bare, size 9 footprint in Cathy's blood on the bathroom floor. By the way, this is ballsy. How did he know Mike wouldn't come home? The only thing I can think of is that Waters said, "I stopped by to see Mike," and Cathy said he won't be home until 3:30. Remember, a towel was found at the foot of the bed. I wonder if he used it to dry off. Waters' clothing had to be covered in blood. The investigators wonder if perhaps he redressed in something of Mike's and carried his soiled stuff and the murder weapon away with him. When he left, he went out the back door, almost certainly to avoid being seen. He would have had to walk around to the parking lot in the front of the building, assuming his vehicle was parked there, but at least no one would see him emerging from a crime scene. Meanwhile, baby Courtney remained in her crib the whole time, investigators believe. They initially thought that perhaps the killer had moved Cathy to where she was found so that baby Courtney could see her from her vantage point in her bedroom. When they reconstructed that, it was evident that the crib was placed so that she could not see her mom. For that, we are all thankful. Another thing we'll never know because Waters isn't around to tell us is what the murder weapon was. Most of the detectives who worked the case over the years believed it was a pair of scissors or shears, the one whose imprint in blood was found on the pair of gray sweatpants. It does not appear to have been the same pair of scissors that was on the bathroom sink. That one was lacking the little finger handle that the shears on the sweatpants exhibited. And that pair of scissors was tested for human blood and tested negative. It's interesting to note that Waters' autopsy did not make any special notice of a scar on his forearm or hand, but we do know that whatever weapon he used, he cut himself with it. Police have not officially tracked down the girlfriend Waters came to Cathy and Mike's apartment with a month before the murder. But Three Rivers Deputy Police Chief Sam Smallcombe shared with me that he believes it was the same woman who was married to Waters when they arrested him, Jenny. Back in the fall of 1988, she was pregnant with their oldest child. The two were living in Arizona, but must have returned to visit their families. Smallcombe cannot ask the wife about this because she won't speak to police. What a terrible realization for her, if indeed it was her, that the social call the couple made to Cathy and Mike all those years earlier had sparked something in her soon-to-be husband that made him return to Michigan in December and seek out and kill Cathy. Unless, of course, she knew the whole time. In the end, baby Courtney was left without a mother. I don't know why her father didn't raise her, but Courtney was raised by David and Audrey Swartz. She got a puppy and a swing set and grew to view her grandparents as her parents. They told her when she was in first grade that a bad man had hurt her mom and she was in heaven. In fourth grade, they gave her more details, and when she was 16, they gave her a box of newspaper clippings. She wanted to know everything. Today, Courtney still seems like someone who has suffered tremendous hurt in her life. Even though her grandparents provided a stable and loving home, of course, she feels robbed of ever knowing her mother. Courtney was planning on watching the court proceedings against Robert Waters once he was extradited to Michigan. She wanted him to feel her presence in the courtroom. But Waters took that away from her, too. She told Wood TV, quote, "They told me that Waters killed himself, but I don't believe that he deserves to be in heaven. I don't think he deserves to be in hell. I don't think he deserves to be anywhere. I feel like he needs to be in limbo where I am with all these questions." After 35 years, Cathy Sue Swartz's case is closed thanks to forensic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they're coming for you. Many thanks to Deputy Chief of Police Sam Smallcombe for speaking with me about this case. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.